as I was saying, succession rules are another area where we see more examples of Bronze Age detail. So the rules of Ishmael's adoption. Ishmael was Abraham's first son, and when it was discovered that Sarah was not fertile, that she could not have children, she gave Abraham permission to have relations and to have a kid with her female slave, Hagar. The process was that Hagar's son, Ishmael, would be adopted by Sarah via a ritual. The ritual involved Hagar giving birth on Sarah's lap. Now, as strange as this detail might seem, we find references to it in other Bronze Age texts from Babylon, early Assyria, and places like that. So it seems as if this was another ritual that would have been common in that day. Finally, the name Yaakov, or Jacob, which emerged as the name of Abraham's grandson, Isaac's son Jacob, his second-born son. And the name Jacob itself is actually a name found in the dialect of Hebrew, Canaanite Hebrew, spoken by the Hyksos. So it's rather interesting that we see evidence that this name itself was in fact a Bronze Age name, that other Hebrew-speaking people record this as a name, which further would seem to suggest that these patriarchs may well have been actual historical figures. So, the Exodus. This is up in the air, the whole business of whether or not the Israelites were slaves in Egypt who escaped under the leadership of a leader known as Moses, who then took them to the land of Canaan, which would become Israel, and they would become the Jewish people, the Israelite people, etc. So, what factors make us think it's fiction? Well, one is that the biggest one is that there's no description of an Exodus event in Egyptian records. Right? There's nothing archaeological that makes us think that this ever happened. Another factor that's often cited is that the census of the Israelites in the desert, given in the book of Numbers, is simply too large. A people of that size would simply have been larger than the entire Egyptian standing army at the time. Now, what makes us say it might be a factual account? Well, one major issue is the inglorious nature of the origin story. A lot of peoples throughout history create origin stories for themselves of dubious account. For example, the Romans claim to be descendants of the Trojans, and the Aztecs say they came from underneath a lake and journeyed southward before finding Tenochtitlan. These stories are kind of interesting. They make the people look powerful or noble. The Romans can claim descent from the rivals of the Greeks. Much more impressive than the pig farming lifestyle common to the Latin people in the valley of the Tiber River before the rise of the city of Rome. So, even the Aztec story has a mysterious and noble type of origin. It came from a land beneath a lake. It sounds mysterious. It sounds interesting. None of those mysterious, interesting, or noble factors can be found in the story of one saying one's ancestors or previously slaves. It's not a glorious part of someone's history. And so it seems a curious thing for a culture to make up about themselves, which would then seem to suggest that the inclusion of such an account would probably suggest the fact that it was actually a factitious origin. Another issue is that there already were Semitic people living in Egypt around the late Bronze Age, particularly the Hyksos. There are accounts by the Egyptians of there being slavery and slave communities, as well as communities of non-Egyptian people living in the area of Goshen, which is where the slaves are described as living in the book of Exodus. The treasure city of Ramesses, which is described in Exodus, is a location we have actually found. So, we found it, we've dug it up, we know the city is there. The other issue is that the Egyptians have a habit of not recording losses. This is one thing that definitely suggests the facticity that while there is no account of a mass exodus of slaves, the pharaohs were not commonly known for recording losses. And so as a result of this, if such a mass exodus did occur, it's not the sort of thing that the pharaohs would have recorded about themselves and about their country. So it's entirely, that could explain the absence of any record of such an event on the Egyptian side. It's that the Egyptians would not have recorded such a loss. So dating the Exodus. So one problem that emerges instantly with the Exodus process is dating the event. So there are three possible dates. So one is 1550 BCE, which would coincide with the expulsion of the Hyksos, whom the Egyptians pursued with chariots through the Sinai Peninsula. So automatically, those of you who are familiar with the book of Exodus will already see some parallels. The Israelite account of their own flight to Israel involves them passing through the Sinai Peninsula and does record the Egyptians chasing them out of Egypt with their chariots. So could they have been driven out alongside the other Canaanite people? It's certainly possible. Now another date given is 1440. This is based on the numbers given in the second book of Samuel. So, in the second book of Samuel, they describe a construction of the Temple of Solomon, and it records how many years it had been since the Exodus when they built the temple. And if that number is correct, since we found the Temple Mound and we've dated the Temple Mound, that would put the origin of the Exodus sometime around 1440 BC. The final issue is the 1240 date, which is based on the cities described in Exodus. It describes that the Hebrew slaves were being used to build treasure cities, as they're called. And one of them is the city of Ramesses. We found the city of Ramesses. We've dug it up. We know when it was built. It was built around 1240, 1260 BCE. Now, timeline complications. So, the Exodus description of the Jewish slaves building the treasure city of Ramesses is dated to 1260. The same time as the Israelite destruction of Hatzor described in the Canticle of Deborah. So this instantly would seem to suggest a rather odd timeline. How is it that you have Israelites who are fighting a war against the Canaanites in Canaan, at the same time as Israelite slaves are still building cities for the Pharaoh? How does that work? We also see a similar reference to possibly a Hebrew people. In the Amarna letters, which were written between Akhenaten's generals and Akhenaten, we receive mention from a fortress commander of an attack by a group of people he refers to as the Habiru. Are the Habiru mentioned in the Egyptian letters, are these the Hebrew people? And if so, that would put them well in advance of the 1240 Exodus date. So what's going on here? Well, there's a line in the Torah where it says that they came up out of Egypt, Hamesh Hamesh. Now, Hamesh means 5 by 5, but it can also be translated as a few at a time. The same way that in English, how when we say, "Oh, I got a couple of minutes," a couple of minutes doesn't always mean exactly 2 minutes on the dot. Well, Hebrew had a similar kind of thing with the number 5. So, the tribal confederation period. So, one of the earliest periods in Israelite history dates from the tribal confederation period, which stretches from the end of the Exodus, whenever that was, 1550, 1440, 1260, 1240, whatever, to around 1040 BCE, with the coronation of the first king. Now, Israel was a confederation. That means a loosely knit alliance of 12 separate tribes. Each of these tribes was ruled by a council of elders. Now, at one or more tribes may be ruled by a leader known as a judge. And a judge, the Jewish people believed that the judges were appointed by God, and they would be a unique leader that would step up, charismatic leader that would emerge in a time of crisis and would take over command of one or even several tribes. And we see references to the judges. And Deborah is a rather famous judge. She was involved in the destruction of Hatzor. She was a female ruler who led a multitude of the Israelite tribes against the Canaanites at Hatzor. Now, despite these victories, the period was also marked by intense lawlessness. There's actually a pretty dark account I might have you read from the book of Judges, which is used to justify why the monarchy was later necessary. And we see accounts of horrendous warfare and brutalities like you wouldn't believe. And it's this lawlessness that eventually leads to the conclusion, in part, that they might need a king. The other reason is that they had to unify because of invasions from the Philistines and the Midianites. So, Israel eventually, the last judge, Samuel, anoints the first king, and the second king, Saul and David. So Saul becomes the first king of Israel. He's a fairly decent king. He defeats the Midianites, and he begins war with the Philistines. However, he is incapable of actually beating the Philistines in a one-on-one battle. The Philistines also kind of had a confederation of city-states. Simply proved too difficult to take down. So, after Saul dies, his sons are killed in battle, most of his sons, and he's succeeded by David, who was actually his son-in-law and one of his most successful generals. David eventually goes on to become king and founds the Davidic dynasty. Before David's death, the throne is inherited by his son Solomon. Solomon extends the united Israelite monarchy to the furthest extent of its borders. He also secures alliances with Egypt and several important neighboring civilizations. It's also this period that a permanent worship center, a permanent temple, is constructed in the city of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, after Solomon's death, the united monarchy falls apart and is divided into two separate kingdoms. One of these kingdoms is Israel, the northern kingdom. It's composed of 10 tribes and had multiple dynasties who often would fight each other to claim the throne. The southern kingdom, Judah, contained only 2 tribes, Judah and Shimon, and it was ruled over by kings of the Davidic dynasty, kings who were descended from David. Now, the Assyrian invasion. So, the Assyrians eventually come and they invade the northern kingdom of Israel. They destroy the kingdom in its entirety. They burn its capital of Samaria, and not Sumeria, Samaria. And they carry off 10 of the tribes. These are sometimes often recited the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The people often wonder what happened to them. They were taken off as slaves by the Assyrians, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, some refugees from the kingdom of Israel fled south to Judah. And they're the ones who brought the text of the Elohist author with them. And it's there that we see the Yahwist author and the Elohist author's sources perhaps first begin to be tied together into a coherent narrative. So, the Babylonian invasion of Judah. Now, the Assyrians eventually fall, with the Babylonians and the Medes rising up in an internal rebellion and conquering Assyria. Babylon then begins to expand westward, and initially Judah is made a tribute state to the Babylonian Empire. However, Judah eventually rebels and is conquered. The Jewish people are carried off into